Okay, kids, it's about 1,000 o'clock, and this is the third time I'm doing this, but you know, the third time's a charm. So yeah, the Articles Confederation. You will learn. So we're not going to go over it in great detail. You have national power. So it's a true confederation than it is anything else. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, which is expressed delegated to the United States, were pretty minimal. And it turns out to be. I put this in there because I want to make sure that you were familiar with the term the critical period, because that's kind of a deal. The College Board is probably going to refer to this time right after the American Revolution as the critical period, because it was, if the country was going to fail, it was going to be now. As you can see, there's a whole lot more frontier areas than there are settled areas. Okay, so the situation in the colony revolution. Every state has its constitution. There are some similarities. For example, most states only gave the right to vote to male property owners. Most states had some kind of guarantee of free speech or free religion. But that's pretty much where the similarities ended. You know, some states gave a lot of power to the governors, some states gave a little bit. It all just kind of depends. Almost every state wanted a republican form of government, but there's no model for us. I think England had a republic after the English Civil War, but thanks to Oliver Cromwell, that turned into a military dictatorship. Rome had a republic for a little while, but that didn't work out well. I think the Swiss actually had republic, but none of that really fits our situation. There was a gigantic crisis because of the war debt. All right, most of the states had borrowed money from their wealthiest citizens. Those guys, the really rich guys in Massachusetts and in Virginia and in New York, they are the lenders. They wanted state governments to raise a lot of taxes so that they could get paid back the money that they'd loaned the states. The debtors, on the other hand, the average guy didn't have the money to pay a whole bunch of taxes. So it creates a lot of conflict. This one, number 4, the competing land claims. All right, there's a ton of new land that we got out of the Treaty of Paris. What are we going to do with it? You need to be able to develop it somehow, but everybody was sort of at odds as to, how do we let them become a state? What's the process for that? Challenges from Britain and Spain. Britain said that they would abandon their forts, and they didn't. Spain completely closed off the Mississippi to us, which that's a huge trading vein. So that was a real issue with us. The fact that we couldn't trade up and down the Mississippi. All right, I mentioned before the problem with land. There's only 2 real success stories out of the Articles of Confederation. One of them is the Land Ordinance of 1785. The other one is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Land Ordinance divided everything up into square sections. All of that new land, it's sort of, they had surveyors go out and they cut it up into square sections. Each one of these sections would be sold off. The unique thing about it is Section 16. We're mainly looking at the Ohio region right there. And you can see they would divide it all up into little square sections, 6 by 6 mile sections. Each of those 6 by 6 mile sections would be divided up, and then you had Section 16. Each of these were sold off. So if you wanted to buy some land in, west of the Appalachians, you could buy, plots 2, 11, 12, and 1. Anybody who bought Section 16, all the money from Section 16 went to go fund public education. So in this township, they called it a township, this township would have a free and public education that was government funded by the sale of Section 16, which is really sort of mind-blowing back in the 18th century. Nobody had public education except for, I think, Prussia. So for us to have public education funded by the government is pretty significant. The other important thing is the Northwest Ordinance. All right, all this land right here, how are we going to let it become a state? Is this going to be one big, huge, gigantic state? Is it going to be done by the population? How many people move in there? The important thing about the Northwest Ordinance is it set up a procedure for territories to become states. And that is pretty important because, I mean, as you know, it started out with us being these 13 states right here. We still have to get all of this territory to become a state, and then Hawaii and Alaska as well. So it divided up the land. It set up requirements for admission to statehood. One of the requirements is you had to have 60,000 people. Once you had 60,000 people and you had a state legislature and you had ratified a constitution, then you could petition for statehood. The other groundbreaking thing that it did was it banned slavery in that region up there. It's the first time in the United States that you actually had an official ban on slavery. But again, the idea was slaves would not be allowed in that area right there. I think if you were a Southern slave owner, you could still cross into the territory to get a runaway slave, but that was pretty much it. Okay, the problems. Now we have to go with Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is because of poor farmers. This is a picture, an actual picture of Shays' Rebellion. It happens in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. Alright, we gotta first start out with our little questions here. Who is Daniel Shays? Daniel Shays was a captain in the military, in the Continental Military. He fought in the Revolution, had done apparently some pretty good stuff in the Revolution. But a lot of these revolutionary soldiers didn't get paid. So when Shays went back to his, farming life, and I think he actually lived in Pennsylvania, when he went back there, he hadn't had his paycheck. And when he got back there, he had a whole lot of tax bills because his state, Pennsylvania, had been taxing its citizens to pay back the Pennsylvania war debt. So when he got back to Pennsylvania, he owed a lot of money, and he hadn't gotten paid. So he's pretty upset by that. Can't blame him. He actually got hauled into court for bankruptcy. He is one of many in that situation. Revolutionary War soldiers who got back only to face debt with no paycheck. I would say that's who he was and what was wrong. He was mad because he was owed money from fighting and he didn't get it. Again, not to mention when he gets home, he has all these tax bills. Trying to pay back because the state was trying to pay back the war debt. And there's no currency floating around. There's a huge currency shortage. Okay, so Daniel Shays got fed up with the situation. And again, he was not the only one in this boat. He got fed up with the situation, remembered, hey, wait, didn't John Locke write about this? If there's a government that's taxing you and you don't feel like you have adequate control of the taxes, what do you have a duty to do? Oh, yeah, it's called a rebellion after all. So Daniel Shays got up a bunch of guys that are in the same situation that he was, former Revolutionary War soldiers. They all had guns anyway, so they started to march on different courthouses. They started to go around and close the courthouses in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, mainly Massachusetts. The reason why is because the courthouses, when you got hauled up for bankruptcy court, you had to go to a courthouse. And so he figured that if you closed the courthouses, then you wouldn't be declared bankrupt and you wouldn't lose your farm. So he started to go around closing courthouses, he and his sort of band of rebels. Later they started trying to march on the Federal Armory. Federal Armory is where the United States keeps all of its guns. So you had a very angry group of people marching to try and take over the Federal Armory. That would be kind of a scary situation. The reaction to it was mixed. Thomas Jefferson was actually in France. He was the diplomat in France at the time. And he wrote a letter saying, yeah, this is actually pretty good. He wrote, I think the actual letter says, a little rebellion now and then is healthy for the country. Later he went on to write a different letter that says the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of martyrs. It's their natural manure, which is gross. But he was okay with the idea of the citizens rebelling. Guys like Sam Adams, on the other hand, were so angry about this they considered it treason. They wanted Daniel Shays and his band of merry rebels hanged. He wanted to actually suspend habeas corpus, put them in jail without a trial. The whole thing ended when a bunch of merchants raised enough money to put together an army. Remember, under the Articles, the government couldn't tax the citizens. So they couldn't really effectively raise an army. So merchants got together, and merchants raised an army, and that's what eventually ended the rebellion. So I think Daniel Shays was arrested and later pardoned. The important thing isn't so much Shays, what happened to Daniel Shays, it's the lesson learned from this. Why it's important is because, not so much the ins and outs of the rebellion, but because it was a wake-up call. People in power, landowners, manufacturers, learned that, you know what, we're gonna have to change the government. We are going to have to give the federal government more power. We tried only giving the state governments power, and it simply wasn't adequate. So we're gonna have to build a stronger union. There's a little magazine article. Daniel Shays there with, I don't know, sword and, I don't know what that is. And funny hats, because everybody back then wore funny hats. That was 1786 is when Shays' Rebellion happens. It kind of goes right along with what's happening around the rest of the country. In Philadelphia, they met in the exact same place where they signed the Declaration of Independence. A group of guys met to try and change the Articles of Confederation. Again, everybody had learned their lesson from Daniel Shays' Rebellion. Look, we're going to have to tweak the Articles of Confederation. That was the original intent. They wound up doing a complete overhaul. They wound up about halfway through deciding, you know what, this isn't going to work. We're just going to throw out the AOC and we're going to come up with a whole new constitution that's a lot more flexible. So one of the good things that they built in was the idea of a flexible constitution. We can add to the constitution as we need to. Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, mainly because he sat down and wrote an insane amount of notes. Okay, guys, thanks very much. I'm hoping that this actually, takes this time, and I don't have to do this stupid video again, because I'm very, very tired. Thanks.